I think I've always worked in a way that's been, it's just like taking it step by step, and it's been in a very linear way. Essentially, it's been like a kind of a thought process that's been illustrated by sculpture, and I think as my language has developed and as my kind of thoughts have developed, that's changed, and obviously now I have this much larger kind of vocabulary that I can work with, which is actually kind of more daunting in a way as well, because you have far more choices, so you have to, you spend a long time scratching your head before you finally actually make it, whereas I think initially it was very much a process of enjoying new materials, working out how to work with colour, working out how to work with form, working out how to make something sort of sit on the floor or lean against the wall, and now I kind of have all this information. The very, very first sort of cast that I made when I realised that you could sort of really change something was I pressed a spoon into sand and then poured some lead into it, and it lost the spoonness of the spoon, so the hollow of the spoon had gone and that had become flat, and you had this kind of little sort of lip around the side, and it completely changed it. From one side it still looked like a spoon, from the other side it looked like something entirely different, and I just kind of fell in love with that process. The first show that I made, which had a piece called Shallow Breath, it was the cast of a space underneath the bed, a piece called Mantle, which was the cast of a dressing table, and Torso, which was the cast of the inside of a hot water bottle. And they were the sort of 4 elements of things that I thought about as being part of either a kind of small bedroom, or it was really, I think, for me about leaving home and leaving my family home, going off to college and staying in these crappy houses with other students. So that was my sort of sketchbook in a way, and also using sort of junk shops around London, and really having a good old sort of poke around to all of these places, looking at all this furniture. So that's where it kind of started, and then when I made Ghosts, and I was really again thinking about my family home more. And I think really just trying to find a way of looking at the domestic as sort of, in terms of relationships, and relationships with people, relationships that people have with their homes, relationships people have with their furniture, and it was trying to sort of bring all those things together and just, I think, quietly talk about maybe some of the darker things. I don't think that using forms that were related to death is something that I'm particularly, I don't find that sinister. I mean, people do, and people think that I'm, obsessed with death. I don't think it's sinister. I'm not, I think there's a very strange, especially in this country, sort of denial of death, and people don't quite know how to deal with it, because people don't really understand it. People, hide. It's not like a kind of celebration of people's lives when someone dies. It's a terrible tragedy, which of course it is a terrible tragedy when someone dies, but I think it's, people have also lived their lives, and things are left behind, and memories are left behind. I think a lot of pieces like Amber Bed, for instance, which is the cast of a bed made in rubber, which came from after having made a lot of work in plaster, and I was sort of frustrated, and I was showing a lot as well, and I was getting frustrated with things getting broken and bits getting knocked off and whatever, and I wanted to make something out of a different kind of material that I could literally kind of bounce around the studio and it wasn't going to get damaged. And I did that with this material and made the cast of the space underneath the bed, which was similar to Shallow Breath, and then had it and didn't quite know what to do with it. And I was, it was very heavy, and I was kind of shifting it around the studio, and I just plonked it against the wall. And it did this amazing thing where it just sort of took on the shape of the wall and sat there slumped against the wall. And it looked like a body. And every time I turned round, I would get a shock thinking it was someone sitting in the corner of the studio. And of course, it started making me think about derelict people. It started making me think about homeless. It started making me think about Hackney and the mattresses that were left everywhere and still are left everywhere. I was using mattresses and beds for all sorts of reasons. But as you kind of work with these things and with, you know, with this material that people have slept on and people have died on and people have, you know, then inevitably it has this whole history and kind of resonance which becomes part of the work. I had this idea that I wanted to mummify the sense of silence in a room. I think that's what mummify the air in a room. I didn't really know how I was going to make it. I didn't really know what it was going to look like. It was just, you know, almost sort of slightly naive. I just thought, well, I want to make this thing, so I'll just try and, you know, see what happens. And found this house up in Archway, which I was sort of delighted with because it was close to where I lived as a child. The room was the right sort of size, and I remember that there were certain things that I wanted in the room, which was a window, I wanted cornicing, I wanted a fireplace, and I wanted skirting board, and, you know, a door and a light switch. And then I spent weeks in there, I remember, deciding how it was going to be made, how it was going to be cast, what size the blocks were going to be. And I was thinking at the time, I remember, about Piero della Francesca's paintings, and I was thinking about proportion. So I was using proportion and also using how the fireplace sits in the room. So I was using that as a centre point and then working from that and worked all the way around. And this process went on for about 3 months, I think. And it really was a sort of learning process. And then I went home one day, came in the morning, and I remember the light was coming into the studio, really beautiful sunny morning, and I saw the light switch, and the light switch was back to front. And I just thought, what have I made? You know, I'm the wall. And it hadn't occurred to me, you know, at all before that. And I realised that I'd made this thing that was quite kind of bizarre, that I'd actually made myself the wall, I'd made the view of the wall. And yeah, it was another point, a real kind of moving point for me, and it's sort of quite a sort of revelation, I think. And I called it Ghost. House is obviously a piece that I'm incredibly proud of. I think it's, you know, a real kind of achievement to have made it. It's one of those things that I went into in a way that was, again, quite kind of naive, I think. You know, I just kind of thought, okay, well, let's just try and do this. And we did it, and it took an awful long time, and it was a massive headache, but ended up with this quite extraordinary sculpture, which touched people on many different levels, whether, you know, they were interested in art, or whether they were interested in politics, or whether they were interested in road building. The piece that I'm working on at the moment is called House, and it's very simply the cast of the inside of a house in concrete. It's a turn of the century terrace house, which is a typical kind of architectural style. I chose the particular house for exactly those reasons, because it's like a kind of archetypal house. What I'm actually doing is working on the interior walls of the house and literally making a building within a building. We're making the piece by building from the basement up. So we're starting with building concrete foundations, because obviously we can't use the foundations to the existing house because they're for the exterior walls of the house. So we've laid these foundations. We're then putting on a layer of white concrete, and then we tie in a metal structure which holds the next layer of concrete, which is like a heavy fill of concrete on top, which is a darker, heavier concrete. This all cures, and then we literally take the building off around the piece. I think house will have a mausoleum quality, but I also think it might be a little like a sort of fossil or something that's been excavated. It's very difficult to talk about the piece because I haven't seen it yet. You know, at the moment it's still all under brickwork. I'm hoping that it will have this very strong but slightly kind of fragile presence, because the actual width of the piece is only about 14 foot. The breadth of it is longer than that, and it'll draw one's attention to the very narrow living spaces that we normally live in. That it may have a depth to it, but it's actually quite narrow. And once the two buildings are cleared from either side of it, there'll just be this rather strange kind of building just standing in the middle of this gully, which is in the middle of a park. The only regret that I have is that I don't feel that I ever really got to see it. I made it, nearly killed me making it, and I actually got quite ill making it. I mean, the stress of it and everything, you know, it was just totally kind of overwhelming. And then, you know, afterwards the kind of media flourish and attack and the Turner Prize and all sorts of other things that happened. And I think I found it a strain, really a strain, and would go and see the piece, but sort of go in disguise and, you know, sit in the car and with a sort of hat on and sunglasses, and just trying to